Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a member of the PMDG 777 beta team. Welcome to the cruise tutorial in the Boeing 777. If you're interested in a written version, check out my 777 ebook, more on that in the video description below. And now let's go right into the tutorial. So we've reached our cruising altitude of flight level 350 and we can now finally start to settle down a little bit and start enjoying our new aircraft. Now, it slowly starts getting dark already, and for that reason we are going to start with just a little bit of how a flight deck would typically look before we go into our procedures. Now, first things first, you gotta turn your seat back right aft. That's the most important thing. You really want a little bit of additional space. Also, pilots have a tendency to close the sunshades in cruise pretty much all of the time, because number one, it's rather dark inside the flight deck, and number two, it also provides a little bit of relief for your eyes. So even though the sun might not shine directly into the plane, pilots really use the sunshades a lot in cruise. Now, that much out of the way, we're about to approach our first waypoint where we can conduct a fuel check. So fuel checks need to be done at least once every 60 minutes. Unless there are only fewer waypoints available, but even in those cases you still need to check your fuel, and we'll talk about both methods, how to do it right now. First things first though, we're overflying the Alpha Charlie Kilo VOR right now, and let's go ahead and write down a couple of values. First of all, we take the time, so we're 28 minutes into the flight. Then we take the current fuel, so 45.6 tons. And then we need the fuel used. Now the fuel used is a little bit hidden in the 777, but you can find it on the progress page number 2. So if you go progress and then next page, leading you to the progress page 2, then you can find your fuel used down here, and it is 9.2 tons at the moment. Next up, let's go ahead and grab our flight plan. So we need to search for our navigation log in here. And here we go, Nantucket VOR. We're supposed to overfly this 27 minutes after we got airborne. We overflew it 28 minutes after. That's 1 minute, not much of a problem. Next up, the fuel that we are supposed to have on board, which is 44.3 tons. And we actually have 45.6, so we saved a little bit of fuel there. Now, if we just think about why we've got extra fuel, then it's rather easy to explain. We loaded 2,000 kilos extra on the ground, and that obviously resulted in having additional fuel at the moment as well. Of course, we also used a bit more because of all the explanations I've done and the longer taxi time. Finally, we got to compare the fuel used, which is supposed to be 7.6 tons. Now we've got 9.2 over here. That would be a clear indication that something is wrong with our fuel usage and that the plane is using a lot more fuel than we are actually supposed to use. Now, for my defense, this is caused by the way I'm recording these videos, so I can explain where the additional fuel usage comes from. When I loaded up the plane on the runway, because I couldn't record all tutorials in one go, when I reloaded the plane on the runway, I had to re-enter all the information in the FMC and stuff like that while the engines have been running, and only after that I adjusted my total fuel to match what I had in the last tutorial on takeoff. So that's why I've got slightly higher fuel usage here. But the important thing is that I can explain where it comes from, and that is what you should ask yourself whenever such a deviation from the flight plan occurs. So ask yourself, why do I have the fuel quantity that I currently have? Is that fuel quantity sufficient to continue to the destination? And does the fuel used and the fuel on board add up? So if we take the 45.6 and add the 9.2, then we should ideally come out at the amount of fuel that we loaded up on the ground. Now, with the slight deviation that I just explained due to the way I'm recording these videos. The 777 is a smart airplane though, and it actually does all of these things automatically as well. So on the left side you got the fuel totalizer, and the totalizer is the value that you see on the iCast. So the totalizer is what you have over here, the amount of fuel that is sensed of the aircraft. Then you've got the calculated fuel. Now the calculated fuel is the fuel that the FMC thinks it should have based upon the fuel load that it initially had on the performance init page. So the amount of fuel that was in here, and then it subtracts the fuel used, and that gives us the calculated fuel. So it can happen that there is a difference between totalizer and calculated. It's just one of those things. Fuel indications in wide-body aircraft are not perfect. Now, in the 777 I've heard of differences between 1 and 2 tons between the totalizer and the calculated fuel. In the A330 that I fly in the real world, we also have differences of up to 1,000 kilos in the fuel that's calculated and the fuel that is currently shown as on board. Normally that comes back when you enter a descent again, and then everything goes back to normal. But these things can happen since we're dealing with massive amounts of quantity here. There are several different reasons for that, but the most important one is that you're aware that such differences can happen, and that you know how to handle them, and that you know when to expect a fuel leak. And that much concludes our fuel check. Now, you're flying long haul. That means it may very well happen that you do not always have a waypoint every once an hour. In that case, you can do a fuel check like this. If you go to the progress page and have a look at what the next waypoint is, then you can write down the estimated fuel on board at the waypoint, and 60 minutes later you can compare that estimate with the current estimate, and that way you can check if any difference in the fuel quantity has occurred. So that's a little trick that you can use as pilot in order to do a fuel check when you have less than one waypoint every 60 minutes. Now, many pilots, especially when you're flying an oceanic routing like we are right now, where there are only few waypoints available, will just do a fuel check over every single waypoint. So even though we've just done one over Nantucket VOR, you would just do another one over at Tusky, because after Tusky you don't have a waypoint for a long time. So that situation that we just talked about is going to happen right over here. If we have a look at the expected times over the two waypoints, we got 23:57 UTC over Tusky, but 01:18 over at Buda, so that is more than 1 hour. And that brings us into exactly the situation that we just talked about, that we still need to do a fuel check once an hour. However, in that case, you just do the fuel check based on the predicted fuel, and of course based on adding up the current onboard fuel and the fuel used, like you would during a normal fuel check, in order to determine that you do not have a fuel leak. Now, from here, let's go ahead and talk about the next important item, and that is situational awareness. Now, flying long haul, you always have to know where you are and where the next suitable airport is located. Right now we're flying along the North American East Coast, and there are loads of airports available, but always think about which are the best airports and when am I transitioning into a different airspace. And a very useful tool for that is the en route chart. Now in the PMDG you've got the en route chart up here, and you can either use the standard en route chart that we've got over here, or if you are a Navigraph subscriber, I would very much recommend you to use the Navigraph en route chart, because this one contains all the boundaries between the different FIRs. It is good practice to mark FIR boundaries on your fixed pages. For example, when we're transitioning from Boston ATC over into Moncton ATC, then we can see on the chart that Tusky is the boundary. So what I'm going to do is I will take Tusky and I'm going to include that in the fix info page. Now we've got a visual indication on our nav display where the boundary between the two airspaces is located. The next thing we have to keep in mind is alternate airports, and this is something that we're constantly checking for on a long-haul flight. So our flight plan only includes those alternates that are used for ETOPS planning or for fuel planning. So for example, you've got your ETOPS airports and then you got your fuel en route alternate. But unfortunately SimBrief does currently not give you other suitable airports along the route. In the real world, our flight planning does that. So, for example, flying along the east coast of the US, we would have Boston over here, we would have Halifax over here, and then of course getting to Newfoundland, you've got Stephenville, Gander, St. John's, and so on. So, you have all those airports. Nonetheless, as you are flying along, you always need to be aware of airports, even those which may not be included in the flight plan. And the best way to do this is using the alternate page in the FMC. Now by default it simply picks the closest airports available. However, we want to make sure that we actually have the closest suitable airports. So looking on our nav display over here, for example that's Boston down here, which is surely a suitable airport, but I'm not so sure if 89 Mike Echo is a suitable airport, even though the runway might be somewhat long enough for a 777. So what we do is we would manually enter 3 suitable airports over here on the alternate page, and only leave the 4th one free, so that the 4th one automatically shows us the closest available. In our current situation, as I mentioned, we have Boston right behind us, then we've got Halifax in front of us, and then we can pick a 3rd airport as well, so we might, for example, set this one ahead to Stephenville up here on Newfoundland already, which is Charlie Yankee Juliet Tango. And like that we now have 3 suitable airports in the alternate page, and the 4th one is just the closest airport available and automatically chosen. You can tell the difference by automatically chosen airports having a smaller font and manually entered ones having a larger font. Now, if you ask 2 pilots, you're going to get 3 answers. If you go onto the airport page itself, then you will have the possibility to enter a wind to the airport over here. Now, some pilots are going to tell you to enter the current cruise wind in there because it gives you a more accurate predictions. Other pilots are going to tell you to enter the wind that you're expecting in flight level 100 because if you have a rapid decompression or an engine failure, you will have to descend to a lower altitude and then divert. Again, other pilots are going to tell you that none of the 2 makes sense because you don't know at which altitude you will be diverting. You might be diverting at cruise altitude if you're diverting for a sick passenger or for a minor technical malfunction that prevents continuing along for the next several hours, or you might be diverting because of an engine failure which drifts you down to level 230 around-ish, or you might be diverting because of a rapid decompression. In that case you'll be in flight level 100. The wind is different at all of these altitudes, so exactly which wind you take, or if you want to insert any wind at all, really comes down to the individual decision of the pilot. Personally, I am lazy, so I just don't insert any wind there at all, because I second the 3rd opinion that you don't really know at which altitude you will be diverting, so I just take the distance and the expected fuel without any wind, knowing that there will be minor deviations. One advantage of entering your alternate airports on the alternate page is that they are marked on the navigation display. So you can see that little A in the airport circle over here, over at Halifax or over here at Boston. And in case the airport that you have selected is further than the maximum range of the ND, if the ND is set to max range like this, then you're going to get a nice little indication. Now let's just switch it to somewhere where it is easier to see. Let's do this. I'm just going to enter a random airport, Bermuda. And now, if you look at the nav display, you can say that since the airport is off the scale of our nav display, it shows us a little arrow pointing towards that airport, together with the information of how far it is away. So we can see Bermuda, 631 nautical miles into that direction. And that is really useful if you're flying on long oceanic segments. Now let's go ahead and delete that again, because Bermuda is not really relevant for our flight, so that we can return to the automatic view over here. Now, since we've been talking about the range of the nav display already, that's also something to consider. Now, be sure to select a sensible range. It doesn't make sense just to go all in if that means that you can no longer see anything decent because there are just too many airports around you. Much rather select something that gives you a reasonable indication. For example, in this situation 320 nautical miles is a good range for me because I get to see all the airports along the coast. I can still read their idents without any overlapping, and it gives me a good look ahead. Always remember that your weather radar is also tied to the range of the nav display, so you don't just want to go to a minimum range where you can't see weather that's coming up ahead, but you also don't want to go to an excessive range where you can just not figure out any useful information anymore. Now, the other thing regarding to diversion airports that you want to keep yourself aware of is the weather situation at those airports. So what we normally do in long haul is we request regular updates of the weather. We can do this over the COM page. If you go to flight information and then TWIP request, and just to add it already, currently the TWIP request is your weather request of choice. If you're flying online, you can also do Asus request, as that is going to request the Asus from an online network. But normally what interests us the most in long haul is the current and most importantly the forecast weather conditions. So for that you're better off using the standard weather request than the Asus request. The Asus is useful for finding out which approach is in use, but that's about it. Now, currently, the PMDG 777 has the flight information page and then the TWIP request in order to request your METAR and TAF. In the real world, pilots mostly use the company menu and then the weather request on there, because it allows you to enter several airports and not just one like the TWIP request page does. So I'm sure that PMDG is going to provide an update for that, but I just wanted to include it like that in the tutorial already. So let's go ahead with the trip request and request the weather for the airports that are interesting to us. So we've got Halifax coming up over there. So Charlie, Yankee, Hotel, Zulu, enter the airport, and we're going to start with a single request and no automatic updates yet. We'll talk about automatic updates in a few moments. We select the weather server of our choice, VATSIM, IVAO or PMDG, and then we can send out that request. We can already do the same for the next alternate, so Stephenville along our route, Charlie, Yankee, Juliet, Tango. And we can enter that as well, and send out that weather request as well. We can do the same for an airport behind us, such as Boston, so let's go ahead and request that same weather over here for Boston. And now we just gotta wait a little bit until the weather forecasts arrive. Another feature that is really useful if you're using the alternate page is the weather request down here. Now, in the first released version of the 777 that's not implemented, I'm sure that at a later point this is going to be made functional. So just be aware, if you just want to get the weather of the airports on the alternate page, you can just use the weather request button down here as well. Alright, our weather updates are arriving. I'm just going to cancel them all out for now. And now we can review them down here on the review page. So, go to review, flight info uplink. An uplink is a message that is sent from the ground to the aircraft. A downlink is something sent from the aircraft to the ground. So, the downlink here, for example, would be our requests, our TWIP requests that we have sent. And the uplink is the answers we have received to those. So let's go ahead and have a look at the current results that we have received. So we can start with Halifax, and for Halifax we have received the METAR over here, and we can see that the weather is not actually all that good over in Halifax. So currently we got wind 180 at 2, it's 2.5 miles visibility in Broome, fog in the vicinity, few clouds 200, few clouds flight level 110 and higher, 15 degrees with a dew point at 15, and an altimeter of 2975. Now, what we would do along the route now is we would always keep ourselves informed about the alternate airports that are available. So you can just change your airport in here, and let's go for Halifax, for example, Charlie Yankee Hotel Zulu. Gonna request those, and now have a look at the different approaches available over there. So first of all, have a look at the airport layout. So we can see we've got two runways over here. The main runway 0523 is 3,200 meters long. And then we've got a parallel runway 32 with 2,300 meters. We could land on both, but we really prefer the large one. So With the weather forecast given over here, 180 at 7, runway 23 seems the obvious runway to use. But flying long haul, you're going to fly over a lot of areas of different magnetic variations. We can see, for example, 18 degrees magnetic variation here in Halifax. And the weather that you get in your forecast or in the METAR is going to be in true degrees, while the runway heading is magnetic. That means we need to correct the wind that we receive over here. The only wind you do not need to correct is an ATIS. Anything else you need to correct. So 180 at 7 with a westerly variation of 18 degrees, west needs to be added, so we end up with a magnetic wind of approximately 200 degrees 7 knots. So runway 23 definitely is our favorite runway at the moment. Now we can go ahead and have a look at the approaches that are available, and we can see that we've got an ILS approach available over here, even an ILS category 2, which has a minimum at 1000 feet radio altitude, or rather 122 feet radio altitude, my apologies for that. And with that forecast, or with that actual weather condition over here, we can tell that we are able to land at Halifax. So Halifax is a valid alternate for us right now. Now we can go ahead and have a look at the next airport. So next up, there is no METAR available for Stephenville, there is no TAF available for Halifax. Well, we'll have to live with that. This just happens, but we have a TAF available for Stephenville. And if we take a look at that, we can see that the overall weather forecast is actually pretty good over here. So Stephenville, we don't have to worry about that one. That one has good weather condition. So next up, let's go ahead and check for Boston, which we also requested. And if we have a look at Boston over here, we can see 22014, gust 20, but apart from that, good weather conditions, so we can land in Boston as well. So all those three alternates are currently valid. And that is what we need to keep track of. Now, if there is an airport that has marginal weather conditions, for example, if we were afraid of fog rolling into Halifax right now, then we could go ahead and use the TWIP request page in order to select an automatic uplink. Now, let's just do that for a moment. So we take Charlie Yankee Hotel Zulu, insert it over here, and if we now click automatic update and select the server, then if we send this out, we are going to get a weather uplink automatically for this airport whenever a new METAR becomes available. And that is pretty useful to keep yourself up to date with weather information if an airport is marginal, so that you always have a valid plan B. Now, talk about valid plan B. The 777 is licensed at a single engine cruise speed between 410 knots in some operators up to 450 knots in others. Let's take 410 for our example today. More on that, by the way, in the oceanic tutorial, but since it doesn't apply only to oceanic airspace, I want to cover it in the cruise tutorial. So the 777 is licensed to fly at a distance from the next suitable airport of 410 nautical miles, which includes, or which is based on, the single engine cruise speed. But there is ETOPS. ETOPS, which stands for engines turning or passengers swimming, well, extended range operations if you wanna, means that you can fly further than 1 hour from the next suitable airport. Now, to make it brief, the 777 can be certified up to 330 minutes diversion distance from the next airport. Many operators have certified it for a lesser distance, such as, for example, 180 minutes ETOPS or 207 minutes, and we can get that information from our flight plan. So we always want to make sure that we are within this area, but more on that on a dedicated ETOPS tutorial. So there is one more thing that we need to discuss, and that is step climbs. Now, on a long haul flight, you barely, if ever, maintain the same altitude during the flight. But much rather, what you are going to do is, while fuel is burned and the aircraft gets lighter, you will climb up to the next higher altitude. Now let's go ahead and have a look into how that is done. And I'm just going to clear that alternate list uplink here for now. So there is several different philosophies behind step climbs. Now we are going to start with the most basic one, and that is stepping up based on the optimum altitude. And this is what the airplane automatically calculates with. So you can see that you've got a step climb forecast in here. And contrary to the 737, this is not just advisory, this is actually based on the optimum, and the airplane is able to carry out that step climb automatically if needed. Now, more on that later on. There is one problem with this automatic step climb functionality over here though. The problem is it does not take the maximum altitude into account as long as it does not climb the actual airplane over the actual maximum. This means the step climb facility is based on remaining as close as possible to the optimum, just while making sure that you remain below the maximum. However, you do not want to climb all the way up to the maximum altitude, because the slightest disturbance may lead to an adverse flight condition, and you really want to avoid that. In smooth air, 777 pilots normally want to keep a distance of at least 700 feet to the maximum. In turbulent air, usually at least 1000 feet from the maximum. The automatic step climb function does not do that. So you can end up in a situation where it wants to step climb you up all the way to the maximum if the optimum is closer to the maximum than the next lower level. So let's say, for example, the optimum turns to flight level 360 and the maximum is flight level 370. In that case, the airplane wants to start the step climb. We don't want to do that. We want to keep ourselves a little bit of distance. The other philosophy is to do the step climb based on the recommended altitude. However, there is no forecast when the recommended goes up to the next available step level. So, in that case, pilots would normally just maintain their altitude even if you are passing the step point calculated by the FMC, and only when the recommended goes up to the next higher level, let's say recommended goes up to flight level 370 and the maximum is 377 or higher, then you would start your step climb to the recommended altitude. If you follow this philosophy, then the forecast fuel at destination might be a little bit inaccurate. The reason for that is that the forecast fuel depends on the step climb calculated up here. So what you can do is you can do an easy bit of mathematics. Basically, optimum and maximum increase by 100 feet every roughly 10 minutes of flight time. You can use every 13 minutes if you want to be a little bit more conservative. So like that you can calculate, okay, my maximum is going to be flight level 377, well, 1,700 foot difference, so 17 times 13, and that gives you the time at which you can expect the step climb. So if we take 17 times 13, that is 221 minutes, and if we divide that into hours, we end up 3 hours and 41 minutes ahead in time. So what you can do now is you take a look at your route page. We are looking for 3 hours and 41 minutes ahead, so roughly 0340 UTC. So that's roughly here at the H5220 point. You could now go ahead and force the step climb over there. So if I enter 370S, then I can tell my airplane that I want to do the step climb at this waypoint. If I execute this, then the step climb in the VNAV page is going to be corrected based on my step climb entered on the legs page, and all of a sudden the ETA and fuel prediction are correct again for what I actually plan to do. And this is a nice little trick that you can use in order to get more realistic step climbs in the 777 FMC. Now, I am going to remove this again because we're going to talk about our step climbs a little bit more when we get to the oceanic part of our flight. But for now, what we can do and what we should do is to have something realistic in our legs page. So another example of what you can do is to go to your flight plan and have a look at the step climbs that are filed in here, and you could enter those step climbs in the legs page. So Buddha, flight level 360, Rylet, flight level 370. So I could do 360S, insert that at bootr, and then 370S, and insert that at Rylet as per our flight plan. And now we would have at least included the step climbs from our plan and have an ETA and fuel prediction based on that. Normally, your flight plan is going to take all these considerations that we just talked about into account, which might provide us with a little bit nicer, a little bit easier step climb functionality. What is important though is that you keep your FMC up to date with the current conditions, so that your FMC is always going to give you a realistic and expected forecast condition, especially including the fuel on arrival. Well, and this pretty much concludes our cruise tutorial. One last thing that we can talk about is if you've got a transponder that has the above and below modes fitted, in cruise you normally want to select your transponder to the below position. The reason behind this is that in any case you see traffic 2,800 feet above and below your current airplane altitude, but if below is selected you see any traffic down to 7,600 or 7,800 feet. And in case you have a rapid decompression and need to start an immediate descent, this gives you much greater awareness of the traffic situation around your aircraft. I do hope that you learned something in this cruise tutorial. I will do a separate tutorial on ETOPS and a separate tutorial on transatlantic operations, so stay tuned for those. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments below. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much. As always, like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. If you're looking for an even more extensive and a written version of this, be sure to check out my Ultimate 777 Guide ebook. More on that in the video description below. Thank you for watching and see you all again on the next one.